Hey folks, Winston for Carbide 3D here. This is the new heavy-duty Z-axis for Shapeoko Pro and Shapeoko 4, or just the HDZ for short. It's a drop-in replacement for the standard Z Plus on both of those machines, and provides two key benefits over the stock Z-axis. The first and most noticeable difference is the size. The HDZ has increased Z travel up to 145mm, or about 5.7 inches, compared to the 95mm on the standard Z-axis. If you have tall projects that require maximum Z travel, have work holding considerations like a vise that elevates your project, or maybe you're using a longer end mill that sticks out of your spindle further, that extra Z travel on the HDZ will make sure you can still max out your clearance under the gantry. The second difference is the ball screw. The HDZ uses a 16mm ball screw which provides smoother motion with less friction than the default lead screw. This makes it suitable for carrying heavier payloads like a bigger spindle. You can use it with the stock 65mm spindle mount or an optional 80mm mount. If neither of these factors is important to you, then you'll probably have a great productive CNC experience with the standard Z Plus on your Shapeoko. But if one or both of these improvements is critical to what you're planning, then you might want to keep watching. In this video, I'll be going over how to install the HDZ upgrade for Shapeoko 4 and Pro. The process is similar for both machines, however, the Pro will require transplanting a few extra bits of hardware to the HDZ versus the installation on the Shapeoko 4, which I'll walk you through in this video. I'll cover the process for the Shapeoko 4 first though, since the physical installation of the HDZ is much easier on that platform. This is because the majority of the drive components and cable management are attached to the X-axis carrier plate rather than the Z Plus itself. To remove the Z Plus on the Shapeoko 4, you will need to disconnect the Z motors and Z homing switch, remove the homing switch bracket, remove the spindle and the spindle mount, and then remove the button head screws holding the Z Plus assembly to the carrier plate. While you're here, this would be a great time to adjust the V-wheels if you need to. To install the HDZ, it's basically the same thing but in reverse. You'll need to attach the HDZ to the carrier plate with 6 included socket head screws, attach the spindle mount and reinstall the spindle, attach the homing switch bracket, and then finally plug in the Z motor and homing switch. At the end of the video, I'll show you how to transmit the correct settings for an HDZ equipped Shapeoko through Carbide Motion, but let's get to the installation on the Shapeoko Pro first. This installation process is a little more involved because there are more things that you'll need to transplant from the donor Z Plus. First, let's remove the spindle and the spindle mount. Now we can disconnect the X and Z axis motors as well as the Z axis homing switch before detaching the drag chain support brackets from the Z Plus assembly. Before we can remove the Z Plus from the gantry, we need to relieve tension on the GT2 belt. Loosen one of the anchors on the X axis and pull the GT2 belt out from it. I like to loosely tighten the anchor back onto the gantry end plate so I don't misplace it or the fastener while I work. Next, it's time to remove the Z Plus from the X axis carrier plate. Loosen the 4 M6 button head screws on the bottom half of the Z Plus assembly. When it's been liberated, place it face down on your work surface as we have some more surgery to do. Loosen the M8 fasteners securing the idler pulleys to the back of the Z Plus. Set these aside for later. Now we need to remove the stepper motor and the mounting block from the Z Plus. I would recommend removing the motor first while you have the whole Z Plus to hold onto for leverage, but it's not a deal breaker if you do it later. To remove the motor mounting block, flip the Z Plus over again. There are 4 screws holding the mount to the back plate, 2 of which are easily accessible if you slide the Z carriage plate all the way to the bottom of its travel. Now to remove the lower fasteners you have 2 options. Option 1 is to remove the lower travel stops on the Z Plus and carefully slide the carriage plate so that the lower bearing blocks extend off the rails by about half an inch. Be aware that doing this creates a risk that the ball bearings may fall out of the HG15 blocks, so if you intend on saving the Z Plus or repurposing its parts for other motion projects, proceed with extreme caution. Option 2 is to more fully disassemble the Z Plus, which has a lower risk of rendering the unit inoperable. Start by removing the M4 socket head screws that attach the carriage plate to the bearing blocks. Then remove the two M5 screws holding the Z-axis motor mount to the back plate. The front carriage plate and Z motor can now be removed from the assembly, providing unobstructed access to the last two screws. Do note that the weight of the bearing blocks can be enough to cause them to move, so take care to keep the back plate relatively level so they don't slide off the rails accidentally. Optionally, if you have some cable management going on, you can remove the cable tie anchor from the back of your Z+. And now we're done with the Z+ assembly. Grab your brand new HDZ and let's start doing all of this in reverse. There's enough movement in the Z-axis carriage plate for you to be able to install the motor mounting block without removing anything from the HDZ. There's a little bit of friction when trying to move that carriage plate because of the mechanical reduction, but you can usually force the carriage plate up and down the axis by pushing on it. However, make sure your fingers are clear of any pinch points in case the friction drops and the axis slides more freely. When in doubt, you can always turn the motor coupling by hand to move the axis. Do not install the X-axis motor at this point, we need to wait until the GT2 belts are run first. You should, however, install the idler pulleys in the appropriate locations below the motor mount. Get these nice and tight, but don't over-torque them and risk stripping the tapped holes. If you want to make sure that these don't come loose, just use a drop of thread locker. Optionally, you can install the cable tie anchor onto the HDZ. This will require an M3 screw rather than the M4 screw from the Z+. Now we can install the HDZ onto the X-axis carrier plate using 4 of the included M6 socket head screws. With the HDZ on the gantry, we can begin the process of running the GT2 belts and reinstalling the X-axis motor. Slide the free end of the GT2 belt under the idler pulleys and fish a loop of belting up into the motor mounting block. Install the X-axis motor back onto the block with the original M5 fasteners, then retension the GT2 belt. Reinstall the drag chain mounting brackets and the Z-axis homing switch, and then plug everything back in. The last mechanical step between you and an operational HDZ is to install the spindle mount and router using the original hardware. If you've surfaced your MDF work area, I like to use a couple 1-2-3 blocks to roughly tram the spindle mount. I will manually turn the motor coupler to gently lower the Z carriage and the spindle mount onto the surface of the 1-2-3 blocks so I know that the mount is level. Then I can tighten the spindle mount hardware and raise it back up. This isn't the absolute most accurate way to tram a spindle, as you're using the squareness of the mount as a proxy for the squareness of the spindle shaft to the wasteboard. The most accurate tramming method is done with measurements directly from the spindle itself, but in most cases this method takes very little effort and gets you more than close enough. Once the mount is securely installed, you can drop your router or spindle back in, and then you're done with the physical installation. Before you use your Shapeoko again though, you'll need to transmit the appropriate settings to the Shapeoko and configure Carbide motion for the new operating parameters of the HDZ. After turning on your Shapeoko and connecting to the machine, go directly to Settings. Do not click Initialize. Hit the button that says Send Configuration Data, and then select the HDZ version of whatever machine you have from the dropdown. Hit OK and wait for the parameters to be transmitted. Next, hit the Load Defaults button and select your Shapeoko version. Then select HDZ for the type of Z-axis you have. Hit OK on that pop-up, then hit OK to close out of the settings window. Note that if you are using a bit setter, you should also disable it at this point. The exact X and Y position needed for the spindle to reach the bit setter may have been shifted by several millimeters during the installation of the Z-axis. You should manually reset your probing coordinates after successfully homing the machine for the first time. And with those steps completed, you are now ready to use your HDZ. If you have any questions or concerns about the installation process, feel free to reach out to us at support@carbide3d.com. Until next time, good luck and have fun machining, folks.